Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle, episode 101. Sheltering in place because of the coronavirus presently. I think the next few episodes after this one, I'm going to do Ozma of Oz, read through that pretty extensively. But I wanted to finish off a two-parter that I started in episode number 100 in talking about behavioral economics. And The Man, this song The Man by Taylor Swift. This is part of a project that I was thinking about before the world went kind of crazy. Um, I was thinking about applying behavioral economics to narrative theory. Behavioral economics just being the tools. It really has very, I mean, just for me, it has little to do with the economics part of it, but more the behavioral part of it. But usually with behavioral economics, uh, a lot of it involves identifying cognitive biases. That's one of the things I'm interested in. Recognizing the role of cognitive biases in the creation of narrative and how to manipulate it to enhance emotional stimulation and stuff like that for my purposes. A lot of times in behavioral economics, it's manipulating it for economic gain. I mean, a lot of behavioral economics types have this sort of ethical focus, and oh, sorry, cat just jumped on me. There you go. Have this ethical focus, so it wouldn't be just for tricking people into buying things. It'll be like how to politely or gently nudge people into making good decisions. So nudge interventions will be in how do you help people make good decisions. But I'm sure plenty of people use these for nefarious ends. So I was thinking of this project where I would look at narrative theory um, and how to make positive change within arts and entertainment using nudge interventions and things like that, recognizing cognitive biases. But just using The Man by Taylor Swift and The Man, Becky Lynch, as examples of uh, gender equality in the entertainment industry specifically. And wrestling is a great one to look at. The Man, Becky Lynch, is one of the most popular wrestlers in the entire world right now. Um, her nickname is The Man. There's a whole complicated backstory behind that. But it's an interesting comparison with Taylor Swift, The Man, the song The Man. The whole concept of that is if I were a man, I would be the man. If you compare that to Becky Lynch adopting that nickname, The Man, interesting direct comparison, but it's also interesting to look at gender equality in the two industries, wrestling and the music industry. I don't have the research on any of this quite yet. This is just entirely a rough draft of a concept of a thinking out loud type of project that I've been thinking about for a while, um, but just from a non-research based perspective on the music industry, gender equality has been a very, very, very slow arc. There's a lot of talk about arcs lately with coronavirus, but you can think of just gender equality as this very, 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 very slow arc of change. Whereas if you look at sort of the idea last time, if you look at Taylor Swift, she's clearly one of the most powerful, popular performers in the music industry, but can you truly say there's gender equality in the music industry? It's taken a long, long way to get somewhat, even the small amount of equality. There's a cat eating a wolf over here. Stop eating the wolf. There you go. I have sculptures all over the place, and Bo's eating a wolf sculpture. But yeah, I mean, so there has been a lot of progress over a very, very long span of time. But still, even the most powerful female performer in the music industry, or one of the most powerful, still definitely has this entirely valid perspective that equality is still far, far from true equality. But you compare that to Becky Lynch, um, and the state of female wrestlers in the WWE. It's not nearly as bad in indies. It's not great in the indies, but I mean it's not nearly as bad in the indies or in other promotions. But certainly in WWE, the state of women's wrestling was in a very, very bad place. There's a whole I could recite those details from memory, but that's beside the point right now. But um, there's a whole complicated history of women in wrestling, and there's certainly plenty of female performers who have put in a huge amount of effort to change it, and it just doesn't go anywhere. A lot of that has to do with Vince McMahon himself, the unabashedly misogynistic head of the company. So part of the project would be here's the whole extraordinarily complicated history of women's wrestling, WWE specifically. But if you look at the arc, if you compare that arc of change just since 2016, the last 4 years, things are falling apart everywhere. It's the apocalypse, clearly. Um, if you say the music industry is a very, very shallow sort of arc over a long, long span of time. WWE, the arc is like this. Huge change in the last 5 years. It's far from perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There's still a long way to go. I mean, in both cases, there's still a long way to go. But just the nature of that arc, this very, very slow arc and this very steep arc. And just as an example, I mean, this has all changed because of coronavirus, but just as an example, when I saw WrestleMania, that's an easy way to boil down WWE storylines is just look at WrestleMania. It's not the only storylines, of course, but if you want to know the storylines from year to year, if you look at the WrestleMania, that's the climax of the storylines. When I saw WrestleMania 27, I saw that one live in Atlanta. There was one women's match, and it was a ridiculous joke match. It featured Snooki. It was just it's a buffer match basically. If you think about this, I'll get to narrative theory eventually. But if you think about narrative theory, the whole function of a buffer match is if you go through this experience of emotional intensity, you have a palate cleanser. And I just got done reading Deathly Hallows. There's so many things to talk about in these videos. And I'll be home plenty. I still have to work from home, but I'll be home plenty to make videos. But I'll make a Deathly Hallows video. But there's an example. There's so many just emotionally intense things, just back to back, that if you have something really emotionally intense and you follow that with something else really emotionally intense, that undercuts that second thing. So you have a little buffer in between, and that helps to highlight just the emotional intensity of these two different things. And women's matches just traditionally fit into that slot. Comedy matches, women's matches, those sort of had the same role. That was WrestleMania 27. And it's been one match a year for a long time. Usually comedy matches are just ridiculous matches. WrestleMania 29, there was no match, or it was just big crazy matches. Like WrestleMania 30 was a big brawl. So the whole series of these matches, the single matches. WrestleMania 32, there were two matches, but that match stole the show. The women's match, the championship women's match, stole the show. Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch, and Sasha Banks. And since then, WrestleMania 32 is 2016. Arguably, it started in 2015. As I said, there's a whole complicated backstory to this. But arguably, it started at 2015, 2016, something like that. But you can mark, the women's match stealing in the entire WrestleMania as a changing point, to the degree that in WrestleMania 33, they had 3 women's matches, or matches involving women at least. Where one of them was going to be shifted to the pre-show, a shift that really doesn't actually matter that much if you think about it. And people protested. And that's another just amazing thing about that women's revolution. Um, on the one hand, just the arc is, this huge arc of change just really drastically um, over a short period of time. And the lack of complaint about it, not that the complaints really matter that much. And I think that's a lot of what Taylor Swift responds to. I mean, she responds to genuine misogyny, certainly, but clearly she pays really close attention to trolls on the internet and Twitter and things like that. She writes a lot of songs about trolls specifically, but just the amount of fan support for that was huge, massive fan support for this change in women's wrestling. Um, Very, very, and this is all just anecdotal. As I said, this is a rough draft of a project idea, so I haven't done the actual research. But anecdotally, from my perspective, very little complaint about this change in women's wrestling. Very, very positive support for increasing exposure and taking women's wrestling really seriously, and it's and a really drastic shift in a short amount of time, to the degree that fans themselves complain about women not having enough of a spotlight. Whereas, I mean, you can compare it to the comic book industry. Very different in the comic book industry. It's very split. I would argue trolls there, they're allowed a very small amount of the comic book fandom, but they're very loud. The anti-SJW part of the comic book fandom, you don't have that with wrestling, which is amazing. But so you go from WrestleMania 32, where there's 2 matches, 33 there's 3 matches, 34 I think there's 4 matches. I mean, I might be forgetting. 30, or I think it's 3, 3, and 3 or something like that. WrestleMania 35, there are 3 matches involving women, and Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair and Ronda Rousey main event 35. So, which is huge. It's a shift as dramatic as saying that in five years from now, cheerleaders will be the a cheerleader will be the quarterback in the Super Bowl. I mean, women's wrestling, I would say, is equally as athletic as men's wrestling. So I don't want to belittle it necessarily, but I'm just saying in terms of the way the company treats them, just purely in terms of how the company treats them, it would be a shift that dramatic. Not to belittle cheerleaders. Cheerleaders are tremendously athletic. It's just the type of athleticism is different. Whereas in wrestling, the type of athleticism and the intensity of the athleticism is arguably equal. But anyway, so the applying behavioral economics to that. There you go. I'm getting around to the point eventually. You can see the chart that I was talking about with Taylor Swift's version of the man, where if you say what is the basic value of a wrestling narrative, there's much more of an actual narrative in wrestling than there is just generally in songs. There's plenty of narrative songs, but that's not a standard part of all songs. Whereas wrestling narrative is just this pure, undiluted sort of narrative of one person versus the other. The pure visceral response there is just a vicarious desire for the person you want to win, and the person you want to lose. That for and against, that pro and con sort of pure visceral response. The paradox that I would say is really key here is the paradox of vulnerability I talked about last time. There's a lot of paradoxes you can really identify, and I talked about Dorothy. This is why this relates to Oz, because, not to get off track, but the whole idea of androgyny being the default of in that primordial sort of form of narrative of all heroes being simultaneously male and female. A lot of that comes from from Ozma of Oz, one of my favorite characters who shifts gender. But I think last time I wore a Superman T-shirt, and I should have pointed this out. But the relevant paradox is the paradox of vulnerability. Through vulnerability, the character gains strength. So a character can be paradoxically vulnerable and invulnerable simultaneously. And Dorothy is a great example of that, where through her physical size and her lack of any sort of outward indications of her ability to be a hero, she seems very vulnerable, but she's actually invulnerable. She's very tough, the toughest character in the whole book. In contrast to the Wicked Witch of the West, I can get off track on that whole thing. The Tin Man is far more vulnerable in every way than Dorothy is, but I can get off track on that. But the paradox of vulnerability, you can also associate that with the Superman paradox, which is somewhat similar, but it's one that's for wrestling fans and for comic book fans, this is a familiar paradox where in wrestling, Superman booking, or the word Superman, is just used as a pejorative. The idea that someone's treated as invulnerable, the whole idea of invulnerability makes it boring, and so you could apply that to somebody like Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar actually, is able to make it somewhat interesting despite the Superman booking. He's a heel, so that really drives up the heel heat, drives up the negativity. The fact that his matches are boring, but that's part of the problem with John Cena. John Cena's booking. That's a whole complicated thing. But the idea is just that in order to be really compelling, character needs to be paradoxically vulnerable and invulnerable. It needs to be tough and weak simultaneously. And that's one of the tricky things about women's wrestling, especially in the perception that the cognitive bias, one of the cognitive biases that's born from that, which is really detrimental to the acceptance of women's wrestling, is the post-rationalization of chivalry, the cognitive bias of chivalry, the whole idea that women are just physically weaker and need protection. But in order to really make for a really compelling story, they need to face some sort of physical danger and overcome that danger. Not the only type of story, but in wrestling, that's one of the keys there. If they're protected by someone else, that strips away their agency and their subjecthood. One of the essentials of feeling really deep level empathy for a character or a performer is subjecthood, the ability to make choices and things like that. So certainly the vulnerability is a key factor. But if you're treating it with post-rationalization of chivalry, the notion that women can't face physical danger because of their vulnerability, they must be protected by someone else, strips away their subjecthood. All that stuff is really familiar with feminist analysis. But I would say the post-rationalization, the whole idea that I'm submitting that is a bit different, is the notion that that our empathetic experience with the female performer ties in with the vulnerability, and the block against acceptance of the female character comes from the post-rationalization. That comes from a whole variety of post-rationalizations, but comes from post-rationalization. Doesn't come from necessarily cognitive biases alone. I mean, certainly cognitive biases, those are a big obstacle. But if we think about cognitive biases, if we think about chivalry, for example, the cognitive bias of chivalry, thinking of it as a deep-seated subconscious cognitive bias, we think of it as an unchanging thing. Whereas if we treat it as a post-rationalization, we don't belittle the pure visceral response. The pure visceral response, that's just the nature of the narrative itself. The narrative itself is eliciting these pure visceral responses. The subconscious is not the enemy. I guess that's my message. The subconscious is not the enemy. We love the subconscious. The subconscious is good. Hooray for the subconscious. But targeting the cognitive biases, that's essentially marking the subconscious as the problem. Whereas arguably, the step after that, the post-rationalization, is the problem. Uh, I would argue that the whole cognitive bias of chivalry really comes from the idea that just on a visceral level, the men in charge, Vince McMahon, whoever else, their response is that they just don't like women's wrestling. And that goes back to, the paradox of vulnerability. The more someone tries to display their invulnerability, the more they're vulnerable. So the more they attempt to show the more overt they make their show of security and strength, the more insecure they are. Familiar sort of paradox that we all know. So if you look at Vince McMahon, he's obsessed with masculinity and showing strength and toughness and all this sort of stuff. But he's a deeply insecure man-child, and I think everybody who knows Vince McMahon realizes he is a deeply insecure man-child. So if we recognize him as a deeply insecure man-child, why would he be resistant to highlighting women's wrestling? Is it because he, genuinely believes that he needs to protect women from the vulnerability of wrestling? Or is it because, as a deeply insecure man-child, he feels like women wrestling would displace his position of superiority? Probably the second, but his deep-seated visceral response that giving women a prominent place in wrestling would displace his hierarchical superiority, that post-rationalizes into this idea that women need to be protected. So one of the obstacles, there are all these obstacles. I mean, if you look at cognitive biases and post-rationalizations, you could identify just a whole swath of all of these different obstacles to acceptance to women's wrestling. And you can look at what happened in 2015, 2016 that really, really dramatically changed all of that. And so just looking at, there's so many of them, but just looking at the paradox of vulnerability, one of the things you can look at, there's many things, but one of the things you can look at is the iconic image of Becky Lynch covered in blood. There was an accident by Nia Jax. There's a whole backstory behind that, but it became this really iconic image. I really want a t-shirt of it, but out of context, if I'm wearing a t-shirt with a woman covered in blood, that might seem really bad. I'll now have to explain. Oh no, she's very strong. This is an image of her being very, very strong. This is not an image of her battered by a man or something like that. This is an image of her, this is the toughest image that she has. She has blood streaming down her face. But it was an accident by Nia Jax. She was punched by another woman. But there, you have a perfect image of the paradox of vulnerability. She's covered in blood, but looking the strongest and the toughest that, she ever has. And so that sort of highlights her as this big star. It was around that time. I don't know if it was specifically that image, but it was around that time that, according to, the rumors and what have you, Vince McMahon started to see that Becky Lynch was the big star. He was behind Charlotte Flair. Becky Lynch main eventing WrestleMania 35, that was a plan for Charlotte Flair specifically. So, it wasn't just Becky Lynch, certainly. It was all kinds of other amazing performers just over the years that broke the ground for this very sudden sort of upward trend towards not perfect equality yet, but, a lot closer. Dramatically closer than it used to be. To the degree, this is a point I was going to make a second ago, to the degree that the original plans for WrestleMania might have been 7 women's matches. There was a rumor of at least 7 matches involving women. Definitely at least 5, but 4 title matches. There's 4 women's titles that are prominent enough to play at WrestleMania in a very small amount of time. And then the Battle Royal. So at least 5. There were rumors of a couple more. But but yeah, so there's a lot of different performers that go into it. It's not just Becky Lynch, and there's another cognitive bias and post rationalization to consider there. The idea that it would just be one. Hold that thought. But the whole idea that she's tough enough where her face is covered in blood, but she's very haughty and very cocky. Very similar to Stone Cold Steve Austin. There's a classic comparison that you get all the time with that particular moment of Stone Cold became a star when he was covered in blood and he was fighting Bret the Hitman Hart. He passed out. That was his star-making moment when he's the most vulnerable. So there's that one. I mean, that's a fairly obvious one. One that got me interested in this, just in terms of post-rationalizations. I'm trying to coin all these terms, but it was the post-rationalization and this is one that comes up with a lot of, like female characters in superhero movies. Think of any sort of example, but that's just one that definitely comes to mind. But the post-rationalization is that fans don't want to see women's wrestling, therefore the promotion doesn't promote it, and doesn't give it a lot of time. So just classically, women's wrestling was the buffer match, or it was a very short match. But it wasn't given a really prominent place. So one of the things that changed it was Sasha Banks versus Bayley, for example, stealing NXT TakeOver, stuff like that. It was different promotions giving them this huge amount of time and space to show their skill. So the whole idea, I'm trying to come up with a good name for this post-rationalization, but the whole idea is that it's a circular reasoning, the circular reason that blocks advancement. The circular reasoning being that we can't give resources to this thing that doesn't sell by not giving resources to it that doesn't give it a prominent enough place to catch on with an audience. It doesn't catch on with an audience, which then justifies the notion that it doesn't sell. Anyway, tell me in the comments what I should call that post-rationalization. I'm trying to coin all these terms for cognitive biases. There might already be a name for that. I haven't found it. I've looked through. There are all these lists of cognitive biases and fallacies, and I haven't found that particular one. It's such a prominent one, and it's such a easy to identify one that there really should be a good name for it. But it's a type of circular reasoning. But again, if you diagnose the real problem, Vince McMahon's deep-seated insecurity and insecure man-childism of Vince McMahon is more than likely the main reason. If he then says and tries to compensate for this insecure man-child quality of his personality, and he says women's matches don't sell, or women performers don't sell merchandise, or something like that, and that's why I don't promote them, and then that sort of circular reasoning. You could diagnose the actual reason by recognizing post-rationalization. So the whole idea of just identifying Becky Lynch as the linchpin. Sorry, I just fell right into that pun, unfortunately. But identifying just her is as a problem in recognizing the forces at play, because of another fallacy cognitive bias that has been recognized. You can identify it as tokenism. You can identify it as moral licensing. So like the cognitive bias of moral licensing, for example. But the idea of moral licensing is that you recognize that there's this disparity, there's this inequality in a particular art, entertainment industry, any sort of business. So let's say this Malcolm Gladwell, of course, had an episode of Revisionist History about this, where he talks about an artist who got into this amazing gallery. I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but she got into this amazing gallery. She became very famous, and then she sort of dropped off the map, and then another woman didn't get into this gallery for years. But I identify that as moral licensing. But the idea is that, if you go deep into that pure visceral response, and you recognize even the most insecure man-child like Vince McMahon will view himself as a good person. It's hard to imagine someone like Vince McMahon actually viewing himself as a good person. But one of the keys to empathy, and I would say that's the key to doing this, is to recognize how to enhance the empathy for the underrepresented performers, but also recognize empathetically the sources of these blockages and things like that. So if we get deep into empathy for insecure man-child Vince McMahon, or any one of these misogynists blocking advancement, and you said, are they able to accept that they're misogynist? Well, no. More than likely, they see themselves as good people, and you'll hear it all the time. They'll say, I'm not a misogynist, I just, fill in the blank. I'm not a misogynist, I just, recognize women don't sell merchandise or whatever. And then they'll say something, clearly misogynist after that. But moral licensing works like that. So, someone deeply insecure man-child Vince McMahon sees there's this disparity in representation of female performers, and he'll promote. Usually, what happens is he'll promote two performers. So if you look, especially if you identify 2015, the marketing term, and there's a lot of marketing to it as well. This is where the behavioral economics comes in, because it was marketed very well, but the women's revolution is what happened in 2015, 2016, that time period. It was marketed as the women's revolution. And I think there's a lot of marketing forces in there that help this be really accepted, but also that, fans wanted this long ago, and WWE finally recognized that fans actually wanted this, but that's beside the point. But what was marketed as the women's revolution, a lot of the narrative that came out of that was other female performers from years past who put in a lot of work to change the perception of women's wrestling. And you can identify, you could identify Wendy Richter, you can identify Alundra Blaze, you can identify China, definitely, for good or ill, depending on how you feel about China. Probably the two most significant, Trish Stratus and Lita, in their time period. We have China, then slightly after that is Trish Stratus and Lita had their big rivalry. And, Molly Holly. You could identify Mickie James. You could identify a lot of different performers. And